My transformation was initiated by a medical crisis. My story is that 2 years ago I was plugging along in life. Everything was good. I was healthy. I had a healthy lifestyle. And as part of my healthy lifestyle, I got an annual physical every year. 2 years ago, when we had the physical, it turned out that the lab work was a little off, so my doctor commissioned some additional tests, and completely out of the blue, I got a diagnosis for a particularly rare and deadly type of blood cancer called mantle cell lymphoma. Hi, I'm David Hoffman. I want to welcome you to Transformations 2.0. This is a video series that explores major life transformations across a broad range of different people. I'm really pleased today to have as our guest Dr. E.J. David. E.J. is a professor of community psychology at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Now, E.J., you've had some really interesting transitions throughout your life. And the first one I'd like to have you talk about a little bit is your transformation when you came to the United States as an immigrant from the Philippines in your early teenage years. Can you sort of tell me the story about that time?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in the Philippines, and when I was 14 years old, I moved from the Philippines to Utqiagvik, Alaska, which is the northernmost point of the United States. And so there were a lot of different ways in which I had to adjust to different things in my life at that moment. In addition to typical, adolescent teenage changes, I had to also adjust to climate changes. I literally went from an island tropical country to Arctic, by the Arctic Ocean. Also, I needed to change or transition from a very different cultural context to the Filipino cultural context to a very American cultural context. And so so those are some of the changes, I guess, that I had to undergo at that time.
Was that easy, or did you have some difficulties making the transition?
It was, it was difficult. Like I said, in addition to the typical teenage struggles, I also had to navigate a lot of the very stark cultural differences. Things that I was used to, things that I thought were normal, things that I thought were just the way things were or are supposed to be. I began to slowly question and challenge those things, those assumptions, those standards, those norms that I thought were just the way the world was. And so there were a lot of challenges, and one of the bigger challenges that I experienced at that time was, this idea that I had to change who I am in order to be accepted in this new country, in this new cultural context that I was now in. So more specifically, I felt the pressure that I needed to get rid of my Filipino values and my Filipino mannerisms, my Filipino traditions and my Filipino culture, and become as American as much as I can in order to be accepted in this society, in order to succeed in this society.
Now, you told me once about a very profound experience you had when you went to your locker one day.
Yeah.
And E.J., I might add, was a two-time All-State basketball player. So one thing that facilitated his transition to a new town was that Barrow is a basketball, Barrow, now called Utqiagvik, at the time it was called Barrow, is a basketball crazy town, and you were a really good basketball player. But you have a story about going to your locker one day.
Yeah. So because of all those struggles that I was going through, I got to the point when I began really trying to get rid of my Filipino-ness in various ways, whether it be my language or my accent or my values and even my social circles. But because I, was playing basketball in high school, or when I was in high school at least, during game days, the cheerleaders and the spirit team would decorate the players' lockers. They'd put, I don't know, posters or whatever on there, and then anybody is, free to write messages on there, like words of encouragement, like good luck tonight or play well or whatever. And so during game day, I went to my locker, and I was, between classes, I was looking through those messages and reading through them, and they were your typical messages except for this one message, and it stood out. It said, "You're Filipino, act like it." And so, really that was my junior year of high school. And so at that moment really was I guess, a turning point. And that's when I started thinking more about my behaviors, because somebody obviously felt strong enough to write that message on my locker. Because I was, I guess, behaving or misbehaving enough, for them to call me out on it. And so that's really the beginning of me evaluating myself more critically, what my values were and what my behaviors have been to other people.
Yeah. Now, you have told me before that sort of self-reflection that began later in high school may have led to a next major transition in your life. And then another major transition is when you began to study psychology in college and ultimately became an academic. So could you tell the story of
That
the transition into college?
Yeah. I don't know, when you invited me to be here, in this project, you asked me about transitions, and I say I go through transitions every day. So there are so many transitions that I can talk about, especially around that time of my life. But in college, when I went to college, I really was not expecting to become a psychology major. Actually, I was a fine arts major when I started college. But then I had to take this psychology course, this intro psych course, during my freshman year. And just very briefly, psychology is the scientific study of, people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And that class began providing me with some answers to many of the questions that I was asking myself, and the questions that I was asking about, my loved ones and the people that I cared about. Questions about, why did I get to that point in my life when I felt like I needed to forget my culture? Why did I feel embarrassed and ashamed of my ethnicity and of my culture, of my roots? And then also I started asking, why did so many people around me felt a similar way? So psychology in my freshman year of college began providing some of those answers for me, like why I thought that, why I felt that way, and why I was behaving a certain way toward other people. And so I fell in love with psychology, and I decided, what, that's what I'm going to focus on. And so really, in many ways, my transition to psychology was very selfishly motivated. It was really motivated by my desire to understand myself better and to understand my loved ones better. Yeah.
Okay. So your area of specialization within psychology has been colonial mentality and internalized oppression. Can you sort of explain those two concepts?
Yeah, so that's really essential. Eventually, when I learned more about psychology and the different psychological phenomenon and concepts, I learned that there was a term to what I was struggling with in high school, and what many people struggle with, which is this sense of inferiority that I felt. I felt ashamed and embarrassed of my culture, and I wanted to erase it and get rid of it. And I learned eventually that people sometimes call that colonial mentality if the people have a history of colonialism, or just more generally, it's called internalized oppression. And internalized oppression is really when oppression, which very briefly and very basically can mean that one group of people is being marginalized in some way, or being overpowered in some way, and they're made to feel inferior or less in some way, right? But eventually, those messages, these societal messages around us, that inferiorizes us, that makes us feel somehow less than other people, eventually it seeps into us. We come to believe it. We succumb to those messages, and we buy into it, and that's essentially what happened to me, and what's happened to many people, is that we grew up being told that our skin color is not as good, that our languages are not as good, that our belief systems are not as good, that our worldviews and ways of life are not as good, and eventually we believe them. And that's why we end up feeling embarrassed and ashamed of our culture, and we try to replace it. And so that's what I struggled with in the beginning. And so I decided that's what I'm going to focus my work on. And so something that, I said earlier, something that started really as a really like with selfish reasons, right? Just to understand myself better, understand my loved ones better. It quickly evolved into wanting to address this very insidious phenomenon that I realized has been affecting so many people across the world for many generations now. So.
Well, EJ, I've watched your career pretty much since the very beginning with a great deal of interest, and at this point I should disclose that you're not only my son-in-law, you're also my next-door neighbor.
Full disclosure, yeah.
So I've had lots of opportunities to observe.
Mm-hmm.
Your PhD dissertation, which was later published as the book Brownskin's White Mind, was a very rigorous academic psychology textbook, essentially. And over the years, I've watched you begin to integrate in your personal experience and personal stories. And as you've taken a really rigorous foundation of academic understanding and a real comprehensive knowledge of the literature, and brought in your own story, your impact, both within Alaska and nationally, has grown, and your message has become much more profound. Could you tell me a little bit about that decision to start revealing a bit of your own story and integrating that into your academic work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's, I was trained as a scientist, and I think we have this, just very generally speaking, in the world of science, we are trained to be as objective as possible, and that anything that is of ourselves, that is personal to us, we need to control it, and we cannot let it affect our work, because then it's considered to be bias. And so then, scientifically speaking, bias of any kind is no good. And so, so I was trained in that way, just like many other scientists. However, I quickly realized that, especially for my case, as I shared earlier, it's undeniable that the work that I do, the area that I focus on, was driven by my own personal experiences and by my desire to better understand the people that I care about better. And so to me, I can either proceed with my work pretending that I am not personally invested in it, which is a big lie and a big delusion, or admit it. And I learned eventually that that instead of seeing my personal connection to my work as something that is a flaw of it, because as something that biases my work. I actually saw it as a strength, because one way that it has become a strength is because people see that I went through it. And so the people that I share this work to, the people that I try to help in some way, they see that I also went through the same struggles. And I think in many ways that actually gives my work a lot more credibility and validity than if I pretended that I'm completely separate and objective from it.
Yeah. So I have read all 4 of your books with great interest. However, your 4th book, which is this book called We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet, Letters to My Filipino Athabascan Family. I've never told you this before, but this is my favorite book. I was in a writing workshop this fall and was asked what my favorite book was, and I said this.
That means a lot. And you've read a lot of books, so that means a lot.
This book is a profound book because it's the book in which you very personally integrate your own story with the literature. So could you talk a little bit about the story of this book?
Yeah, well, this book, it's deeply, deeply personal, this book. Really the catalyst for this book was when one of my best friends was shot and killed by a police officer in his own home, and in Utqiagvik. And so when that happened, it affected me deeply, and it still does to this day. And I just felt so much anger and so much pain in me. And I just wrote this, about 3 years ago. Despite all of my understanding, despite all of my academic knowledge and my scientific training, and despite the fact that I've been talking about this for many years now, these topics for many years now, after my best friend Pamiak was shot and killed, none of that helped me. None of my knowledge and my scientific training helped me deal with it. And so I felt like I needed something more. I just spiraled into this depression, and despite my knowledge of all of these things, of the statistics, of everything, none of them were helping me. And luckily, I have this I guess skill to write, which I am very lucky to have, and that not many people have. But I had an outlet, I had a way to express myself and hopefully, explore my struggles through my writing, and hopefully, with the hope that it'll become therapeutic. And so I just started writing. I started writing, and I started writing to my family. I started writing to my wife, Margaret. I started writing to my kids, to my sons, and to my daughter. Just expressing to them, these fears, these anxieties, these struggles, these confusions, and anger and pain that I was feeling at that moment. And one of the many interesting things that came out of that process was it actually did help me. In the process of writing this book, I came to realize that I needed something more. I needed something more than understanding and consciousness, and awareness of these issues, to help me deal with it, and to help me try to do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can support this series in 3 ways. You can click, like, and subscribe.
but one thought that I thought about, because when I apply that to that struggle, to me transitioning to America as a young boy and trying to become as American as possible, me wanting to become a butterfly was actually the problem. You know, that perhaps there was nothing wrong with being a caterpillar. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's just one thing that I hope, you know, we kind of think about more deeply when we think about transformations, is what are we trying to transform to,
Yeah.
right? And who's deciding that it's better to transform to that next phase.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.